Hi there. If anyone has any questions, I'm outside, as you can see. I will answer them, and in the meantime, I think I mentioned this book a few times, Reflections by Idries Shah, but I take this with me when I have errands to run that I might have to wait around for, and I flagged a couple of anecdotes from here that I think are sort of illustrative of points that I haven't really had a chance to work into videos yet. So here's one, The Nail. A man and a nail had a conversation. The nail said, "I have often wondered during my years sticking here in this panel what my fate is to be." The man said, "Latent in your situation may be a tearing out with pincers, a burning of wood, and a fall, the rotting of the plank, so many things." Said the nail, "I should have known better than to ask such foolish questions. No one can foresee even one thing that might happen in the future, let alone a variety of them, and all so very different and unlikely." And he waited, having learned this nail wisdom, until someone else should come along, someone who would talk intelligently and not threaten him. A few more of these that I might read, but anyone questions? Yes, there's two people here now. I also might preview some stuff that I haven't announced yet because I'm working through. Still need to do the book club. I would have been more on top, except I need to actually figure out what I'm going to do for a poll for like timing, because I can't just use the YouTube poll, and I keep putting that off. So I'm actually going to try to do that tomorrow, now that I'm talking about it, now that I've actually said that. I've been thinking about, I've talked about a few times on the channel, I, as a kid, I wanted to do jobs that would be what Pierre Bourdieu would call symbolic capitalists, like creative jobs, right? And I ended up doing those, but not in a rewarding way, and I don't really share the values of a lot of people who sort of end up aspiring to those jobs. So I've been trying to figure out, can I be like an entrepreneurial capitalist, a capitalist? I think. Hi, thank you. Yeah, Leela, since I haven't actually tried recently to get her. In the spring, it was Quaker breeding season, and she did not want to leave her cage. Might try again. I have a video on Uplift that I want to do. Anyways, sorry, this was me saying I'm going to start a storefront for the channel, which someone suggested a few months ago. I need to figure out, I'm probably going to start on Zazzle, and I might, start with just the channel logo, try to do other things sort of as it takes me. Let's see. If anyone has questions, no one has questions, I'll do another reading from Idries Shah that I've been marking some of these. If you want to ask questions, go ahead. Last time it took a while for people to have questions, so I was like, I should have been reading. I reread this book, I don't know how many times at this point. As I said, I take it with me to, like, when I have errands to run, but I've only recently, as you can see, started putting sticky tabs. I've been doing that with books that are rereadable and quotable. And so another one, here's a good one. Once upon a time, there was a cheese, and a number of cheese mites took up residence in it. As time passed, they bored more and more holes into the cheese, and of course they multiplied. Then one day, there were so many holes in the cheese that it collapsed into a powder, leaving the mites scrambling in the ruins of their home. "What traitor is responsible for this?" screamed the mites. Then they formed parties, each opposed to the other, whose objectives were to restore the former ideal situation. Some mites, it is true, found another cheese, but as for the majority, they are fairly rapidly consuming the remaining cheese powder. This book, I should probably make a video just on Idries Shah at some point, and this is his most rereadable book. But it's also, there's so much in it that I'm not sure. So this is a zero gravity, like, folding chair that I got, and typically this is out on my deck. And so this is normally, like, if I'm reading in the day, I'm out here. And in my video on 3 rules for reading for March 3rd, I said, like, you should generally have a place that you are reading that you're not using screens, and I'm kind of violating that here, but it's like a one-time thing, so it shouldn't screw that up, hopefully. But I'll typically read out here in the morning, like when I get up, until when the sun comes in and makes it too bright, and then I'll typically read out in the dark. One of the things is I struggle to maintain a good sleep schedule, and so getting sun exposure as soon as I get up and sun exposure when the light goes down help keep my sleep schedule at least somewhat reasonable. But yeah, this is, the particular brand is Sportsman's Guide. Yep, I agree. Well, it's also, beyond that, like in modern politics, both sides feed on each other while sort of having the same, mostly the same underlying flaws, and then a few that are sort of complementary opposed blind spots. I think, like, I come from New England, like small town New England, and we have town meetings. And in like town meeting, I think it's possible, because you're talking with your neighbors, to actually sort of have functional democracy. But representative democracy, like when the Constitution was written, the founders were like, we need to avoid parties because parties are like what's sort of screwing things up in Britain. But of course, you can't really avoid parties like at the scale even of when the country was founded, much less the size it's gotten. I don't have an answer, but I am sort of, I don't know if any of you watch Nima Parvini. His channel is Academic Agent. He's one of my most frequently overlapped channels, and he's the author of The Populist Delusion, which I've talked about a few times. And when I initially talked about it, I was skeptical of his thesis, which I think it was like, you can't have a functional democracy of more than like 10,000 people, if I remember correctly. And I'm like, that seems wrong. And in practice, anything beyond that just becomes an oligarchy. And now I'm like, yeah, I think probably he's right about that, unfortunately, which I don't like thinking he's right about it. I haven't heard of Agenda 21 or 2030. And I don't think I've heard of the book Green Tyranny. I did. Amazon was aggressively recommending a book, Deep Green Lies, to me for a while, which was from some people basically claiming that you can't have growth and also stave off like climate catastrophe, and we need degrowth. And I was very much still in sort of the libertarian, like we can grow our way, like have technology get our way out of these problems. I don't know, maybe I should read that one now, but I have so many things I want to read that are higher priorities. But yeah, I haven't heard of Green Tyranny or Agenda 21, 2030. This is another passage that I want to elaborate on at some point in a video, I think. Clever and profound. Statements which are merely clever and which have no development potential are often imagined to be profound because they look or sound attractive. And profound remarks which have indeed got development potential are as often deemed to be no more than clever. Both sides are implementing, like the US and China, you mean? Developing and developed world? I'm sort of skeptical of, like, on one hand, like when the UN or these organizations have these big plans of them going anywhere, but at the same time, like, as I mentioned, I think in my video on Imagine, like when the World Economic Forum, like they don't have the power, like as a group, to get what they want, but it does sort of represent what people like that aspire to. Which, of course, for the wealthy, it is very much in their favor and powerful to, instead of owning things, to have essentially permanent renting that you can control. Oh, Trump, Biden, and Obama are all behind this? And Clinton and Bush. Okay, yeah. I've observed that the vast majority of the time, whenever something gets bipartisan approval, it's because it's a particularly bad idea. Patriot Act, there was a lot of basically anything that Ron Wyden is like the only senator to vote against, like, or I think sometimes Rand Paul votes with him too, but at this point I've sort of, as I said, I've given up on, like, I wonder, can you make Again, I'm not necessarily sure about the threshold. Again, I think Parvini said 10,000. But states like smaller states, like with like under 2 million people, tend to seem better governed than larger states, which I don't know if anyone here is anyone here familiar with Andrew Heaton. He is like a comedian, journalist guy for Reason. But anyways, he, a friend who's a big fan, and I sort of discovered him independently, but he has speculated, like as a hypothesis, that it seems like smaller jurisdictions tend to be better run, and I think that's because they tend to have more accountability. And so you see, like, for example, like Nebraska or Utah or like Vermont or New Hampshire. I mean, it's not always the case. Coming from New England, I always got the impression Rhode Island was pretty poorly run, even though it's a small state. But Rhode Island also has sort of a culture of machine politics that Vermont and New Hampshire don't have. And Maine has done some dumb things despite being a small state. But well, Maine has really done one dumb thing that I have a big chip on my shoulder about, which is the bird who was in my videos, Lila the Quaker parrot. So they were brought in like from like Argentina in that area because they were agricultural pests, like in huge amounts. And the trucks of wild caught imports would escape and establish populations. And so a lot of people worried they would become invasive. And so a lot of states banned them. And then it became clear that in the US, they aren't agricultural pests and can't really function outside of urban areas, but they're still an annoyance to like electric companies. And I actually have a video that I did a Nerd Nights talk, and I want to actually talk about this. But anyways, Maine became the first state to go the other way because a lot of these states are realizing they're not a threat and started unbanning them. And then Maine went the other way and banned them with no grandfather clause. Aiden Baloo. No, I have not. Or Aden Baloo is Aden Baloo. Let me look that up. I'm curious. Oh, Christian anarchism. Okay, that's interesting. I'll definitely have to look into him. Yeah, as I mentioned in some of my videos, I'm sort of, at this point, I'm questioning the foundations of like philosophical liberalism, at least as we've interpreted it. And so I've been trying to read critics of that from various angles, which I'd say there's broadly sort of four, which are, so there's Marxism, left anarchism, perennialism, and the people who call themselves sort of reactionaries or neo-reactionaries who like fully reject liberalism in principle. And while I'm wondering, can liberalism sort of still be reconstituted under older conceptions? I still think it's helpful to read the critics, and it's interesting because the critics all still share most of these same assumptions as I do. Like it's amazing how much we argue over like the small differences we have when we all have so much we take for granted in common, for better for worse. Founder of Hopedale, Massachusetts. Oh, interesting. Where is Hopedale? I haven't heard of it, so I'm assuming it's not in Western Massachusetts. I feel like I know every town out there. Okay, Central Mass. Yeah. Central Mass, almost to Eastern Mass. Okay. Oh, Michael Sartori. Hi. Michael Sartori. Sorry, I read a couple of your blog posts, meant to comment, and then I am a mess in terms of all the things I've been meaning to do. Yeah, Worcester County. Yep, I saw that. So I'll look into him in a bit. One thing I'm thinking, so as I said, I want to do a store, and one thing I might try to do is posters. And the first poster that I'm kind of thinking I might want to try to do is try to do like a sort of illustrated history of, yeah, if you want to like do a recorded conversation, like an interview, I'd be happy to, if you have like, I'd be happy to do that. I've done one so far. Another person reached out recently, possibly doing it next week. I'm not sure. Thanks. I mean, I am kind of riffing off the top of my head generally with my script, not scripted, my pre-recorded videos as well. I will occasionally, like if I'm trying to remember, I have stuff I want to say in order, I'll like print out a list of stuff to try to get it. And with my 4th of July video, I was looking, I like wrote down everything that I could think of that I wanted to discuss, and then still forgot 3 things, which is why I usually try to do the videos ideally 2 days in advance. So if I can, oh, I forgot this, I can go back and do it the next day, though I don't always manage that. yeah, Michael, if you want to reach out, email me. Like, I would happy to do an interview, or record a conversation or podcast, whatever. So the way I cross-reference books, do you study them or just hold them in your head? So it's interesting. So unfortunately, my video trying to talk about the Bayard and Hitchens books didn't do well. I screwed up the audio. I also was experimenting with making it more sort of Proustian, and that's sort of how I talk naturally. And seems like people didn't like. I mean, obviously the audio screwed up, but also didn't like that sort of arrangement. But one of the things that Pierre Bayard sort of talks about is this idea of, so he has these 3 libraries of the mind. So I believe they are now I'm blanking on what they're called. I look it up, but they basically correspond to, so the objective in terms of social reality, the subjective, and the intersubjective. And the first one of these, so the one that's equivalent to the social reality, the objective social reality, is basically how our culture sort of books link together. And that is, so one of the books I've been meaning to read is Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, which so many people have talked about helping them. I don't know if any of you watch Allison Talks Books, but she was in the last live stream I did, and she mentioned, she wasn't sure if it would be helpful to me because I already kind of do the highest level, because he has sort of 4 levels. And I know I already do the highest level. At any rate, the highest level is syntopical reading, which is comparing, like, how do these ideas relate to each other? Like, how are they similar? Who references who? How do they contrast? And I've talked about, like, part of the reason I remember things so well, I think, is because of frameworks. And so having this sort of thinking about how do these thinkers relate to each other, I think, is helpful there. And that is, like, hello. Even when I was a kid, when I was in high school, I took a course on ancient and medieval, like, religion and literature. And I wrote a paper, like, not even for the assignment, just for the fun of it, like doing a sort of Plato symposium type thing, or trying to do that, but it was more of it wasn't as formal as Plato, for a number of sort of religious and philosophical figures. And so that sort of tells me, like, I've been doing this for probably since high school, of thinking about how these ideas relate. And so I do go back and I reread books that I read a while ago, especially. Not as much as I would like, and I've been trying to do it more. And one thing I've realized I can do is I can often remember something in a book I've read, I can go back and find and reread that part if I'm sort of trying to check, am I getting it exactly right? But yeah, I don't go back as much as I have. If I read Dark Aeon, I'm interested in transhumanism. I like science fiction books about transhumanism as sort of a symbolic, like, spiritual thing. I don't think transhumanism is likely to ever actually happen. I think fundamentally, so I'm doing another Nerd Nights talk actually in November about cybernetics and sort of the limits to what we can know, basically. And both Friedrich Hayek and Ted Kaczynski made the argument that we basically, and so if I've talked about Arthur Koestler and his idea of holons and holarchy, and basically in different terms, they both made the argument that you cannot understand the organization of higher level holons. And so humans, like, in a society, we might feel like we could understand the emergent properties of our societies, but we really can't, at least in a way that's useful. And I think the same thing is, like, true of our biology. And so transhumanism, which requires an understanding of biology that I think we are basically incapable of understanding. I haven't heard of Dark Aeon. Yeah. So podcast 2 months ago that I did with Zarina Macha, I mentioned, like, feminists try to cherry pick and uphold traditional, so they, like, some aspects of feminism and some aspects of gender norms. And so, like, of course, it's one of those things where as soon as I'm trying to think of examples on the spot, I'm kind of blanking on good ones. Like, the one that people like sort of college age boys and ones that level like to complain about is that women want to, like, be treated equally in most respects, but they want the men to do the asking on the day and the pay. And I'm like, that one doesn't really seem like a problem to me. because that one is, it's fundamentally like just being the one to ask on the date and like pay is such a petty, trivial one. But there are ones. So I talked about in a, which video? I don't remember which video it was. It was a recent one. Like, so it was the, oh right, it was the books that backfired, because I was talking about, like, I've had a lot of experience with feminists telling me that I should be like more argumentative, like go up to men and like argue and like teach them about feminism, because men don't listen to women, but they listen to other men. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's not true. Like, I was in a server that was probably the most male exclusive space I had been in for a long time. Like a couple of years ago, a friend invited me. She was the only woman in that server. And they definitely took her way more seriously than they did me. And that might have been partly because she was a woman, but it was certainly, they knew her. And so they trusted her judgment. But anyways, so you have this, like, expecting men to like embrace feminist principles and then adopt sort of traditionally masculine, and I think sort of often a misunderstanding of traditionally masculine roles, because the assumption that you should be being aggressive and picking fights is basically, that's not really traditional masculine as I understand it. That is what other feminist critics, like theorists, have rightly critiqued as toxic masculinity. So they're like, yeah, keep the, like, obviously treat us as equals, but then also go embrace feminism and like evangelize it, like using traits that we would call toxic masculinity otherwise, which is still not the best trait or best example. There's others that I've thought of that are more profound, but I'm sort of blanking again right now, trying to think of it off the top of my head. So Dark Eon. Sorry, I entered about transhumanism, but I will look up Dark Eon. I do know the YouTuber Strange Eons. So oh, interesting. So this is a critique of transhumanism, but it looks like it might be, is this a novel? Huh, Stephen Bannon wrote the introduction to this. That's interesting. There was Musa al-Harbi, I think it was talking about, yeah, elaborate a little bit. If I, again, off the top of my head, I'm forgetting. But anyways, Musa al-Harbi, I think it was there was someone who I was very surprised. I think it was Musa al-Harbi, who was basically saying that Tucker Carlson as a writer and Steve Bannon are more credible than like their opponents give them credit for. And as far as I know, Steve Bannon hasn't like written any manifestos type things. I've been meaning to look up the Tucker Carlson book. This, I think it was al-Harbi mentioned, but it hasn't been top priority for me. But it's interesting that Steve Bannon wrote the introduction to this one. And that's actually the video that I don't like him either. But the interesting thing is, whoever it was who was talking about it was basically saying that he sort of identified a lot of the problems with what different people would call like neoliberalism, symbolic capitalism, managerialism, but with that kind of thinking. So what ideas am I grappling with? What am I looking forward to finding an answer with? So there's, I would say there's really, let's see, like there's a number of interconnected things. And so like, and they're all practical, but then some of them are like less practical, but they're connected to it. So one of the ones that I mentioned is trying to sort of understand where I stand with respect to sort of the assumptions of philosophical liberalism as I was taught it for most of my life, and whether what makes sense, what doesn't. And part of that is because I'm trying to figure out what to do with my life and how to do it. And again, my goal is I want to find a partner and have kids, and I feel like the best that I can do is to make self-employment work, which I'm still struggling to figure out how to do that. And I think one of the things is I probably want to make a video about this at some point. But so as I said, like, because sort of creative stuff, what Musa al-Harbi and Pierre Bourdieu call symbolic capitalism, is basically essentially zero sum. Like, you can only have so many people doing that, and it is very competitive and often increasingly winner take all. I had ruled that out young and tried to do, well, I tried to do it a little bit, didn't push it too much. And I realized, I think the thing is, I'm capable of being a writer's writer. I'm not sure I'm capable of being a writer in the sense of I was actually talking about someone recently, and I want to make a video on this at some point. But I like you have sort of, I feel like you have at least 4 levels of like creative people. So you have the mainstream hit successes who sometimes they endure, usually they don't. But you know, J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, Agatha Christie, who does endure. And then you have the people who are less mainstream and are actually sort of read by the people who see themselves as intellectuals. And so that would be Ursula Le Guin, Margaret Atwood, Vladimir Nabokov. And then you have the people who are like the people who see themselves as intellectuals aspire to read them, but usually don't. And so that would be like Borges, Proust, people like that. And then you have the people who are strictly like writers who often, so Borges and Proust are kind of writers, but you'll have sort of wannabe intellectuals will still try to read them. And then Borges, and then beyond that, you have the people who are sort of writers, but people don't even know. And again, my favorite writer, Jack Vance, science fiction writer Jack Vance, is probably in that category. And anyway, sorry, this was sort of tangent, but I was, yeah, so I ruled out being creative successfully because I was trying to be like, if not Stephen King and J.K. Rowling, at least like Ursula Le Guin or like Vladimir Nabokov. And I don't think I'm capable of doing that, or at least I'm not capable of doing that until I've gotten good at being more of a writer's writer. And so I ruled that out, and I was like, I want to try to like start a business, which I still might do, but I'm thinking it might be more creatively oriented. So I've been like, how do I figure out what can I do to sort of make money in a stable, sustainable way? Because it's going to be very hard for me to get another corporate job and to actually make that work without accommodations. And then it's ultimately a lot more fragile than people realize. And so my thought was, well, maybe I should, the people I know, like who I relate to, they are generally, I'd say about maybe 2/3 of them, they got a job where they basically made their own role at a small company, and then they've sort of been like indispensable there. But I don't know how I find those companies or how I do that. And most of them tend to be like Gen X or older. So I don't know if that's still possible. And then the other third have generally been entrepreneurs. And so I'm like, that's what I should do just based on those examples of people I know, but I'm not sure. So I've been trying to figure that out. And then I've been trying to figure out, well, the elite theory question of how much do you need? It's elite theory, but also it's questions of, I'm realizing most people really just want someone to tell them what to do. And so how do I reconcile that with my own, I'd call them my own sort of democratic inclinations, although a lot of that is certainly, it's the conditioning I was raised in. And then finally, it's the question of like, how do we make gender roles work in, because the way things are now, like, and I know people don't like the idea of like a sort of romantic marketplace, but it is kind of what we have. And I post that I started writing that I couldn't quite wrap up that I want to finish talking about this. And with agriculture, that sort of went really heavily in favor of men to a degree that you don't really see generally in hunter-gatherer societies. And now with managerialism, it seems like it's going the other direction. It's sort of in favor of women, or at least like in the upper class, like educated classes, that is pretty much close to unprecedented, like in human history, as far as I know. And so it's obviously not like an adversarial, like direct market, but it is like sort of women have at this point an easier time being employable, like in the top level, like white collar managerialist roles. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that you're going to get men to do the routine housework or early childcare more to make up for that. And so the question I'm grappling with is, like, certainly it's not something I think makes sense for me. And so the question is, what other things can I do to sort of make up for that, account for this is where the sort of the dynamics are going, if that makes sense. So, Rusa Corey, behind the green mask, you and Agenda 21. Okay, I'll actually Google Agenda 21. Yep, it's okay. So this is actually, it's a argument for sustainable development from Rio in '92. This has been around for a while, it looks like. Yeah, although the point I'm making is I don't think you can really just flip gender roles and say, okay, because women are now better positioned to be like routine earners, men should take on traditionally, like men should take on the routine housework or like the early childcare. Because I think we do have sort of evolved in propensities that are going to make that hard to work. And like I've seen a few cases of guys who were like stay-at-home dads, basically, and typically it ended up being that the wives ended up resenting them, assuming that they didn't have jobs of their own, because they're like, hey, you're not bringing in an income at all, but you're not doing the amount of like housework that I would be doing, or even like fathers parent differently, and fathers tend to be less helicopter parenty than mothers tend to be, which is not, it's not a good example, because like not all mothering isn't necessarily helicopter parenting, but it's more in that direction. Lingo in our township board meetings, the tiny township with 300 people. Thanks. Yeah, as for the entrepreneurial path, I think that's where your journey is going. Yeah, I think I'm definitely starting some kind of business, but I was initially sort of trying to focus on a lifestyle. How do I make a lifestyle startup that I could kind of scale? And now I'm thinking that it might make more sense to see what can I do creatively and then figure out how to monetize that, just because that's easier for me to keep trying to do. Yeah, so feminist vague, but it has no meaning. I think this is, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of semantic bleaching, which is basically words tend to, well, actually with feminists, I think it's a little bit different, because I think feminist sort of has the same trajectory as liberal, where liberal initially it sort of meant generous and open-mindedness, and then it sort of came to refer to liberal philosophy and classical liberalism, and then it was gradually expanded to be sort of social liberalism, which was often like close to social democracy. And I think feminism too, like, because initial feminism was basically sort of arguing for women to have like basic property rights and voting rights and sort of stuff of that nature. So first wave feminism was property rights, voting rights. And then second wave feminism was, okay, well, mostly focused on the concerns of middle class women and sort of how the post World War II economy wasn't meeting them. And then third wave feminism was, well, you're not really taking into account poor women or women of color or queer women. And so, like, how do we account for that? And then fourth wave feminism, people disagree on whether there is fourth wave feminism, and if so, did it start with the Me Too movement? And I would argue that it did, because I saw a shift with the Me Too movement, such that a lot of ideas, sort of fourth wave feminism, like with the Me Too movement, you saw it became much more popularized, much more of a mass movement, and it incorporates ideas both from third wave feminism and from second wave radical feminism in ways that often, like, so they often misinterprets these concepts, but when it does, like, it sort of applies them. This is the thing with any mass movement, is that it tends to, most of the people who adopt it aren't really thinking it through and are sort of grabbing at what seems convenient without really thinking about it. And so I think the thing about feminism, I mean, even with second wave feminism, you had the split between liberal feminists and radical feminists, and then you had splits within those groups. And then now you have sort of first wave feminism isn't really around anymore, but you still have both, at least sort of, you have second wave radical feminism around, but you also have like second wave liberal feminism kind of too, to some degree, like, although it's more with older people. And then you have at the very least, you have second wave radical feminism, third wave feminism, and fourth wave feminism sort of coexisting, and they all kind of mean different things to different people. And then even within those groups, you obviously have it. So I think, because semantic bleaching is when a word sort of becomes used either in a positive or negative sense, wider and wider, until it just sort of means positive or negative. And so that would be like awful and awesome. Both, they meant roughly the same thing. And then, they had sort of narrower specific meanings. And then they gradually, awful just came to mean really bad, and awesome came to mean really good. Whereas I think feminism sort of has the same trajectory as liberalism. But yeah, to some it means reading theory, to some it means stupid tweets. Yeah, I think that is a good I mean, that's a good observation of, I think, any sort of political movement that becomes, even to some degree, a mass movement, even if it's only like a mass movement within like wannabe intellectuals. Yeah. Yeah, if you have communist feminists and female CEO feminism, what does feminist alone mean? Well, I guess one thing about that, though, is so I studied cognitive psychology or cognitive science in undergrad. And one of the things that we have is prototype theory of meaning. And so, like, and someone I was reading recently was talking about this. It might have been Richard Rorty. I'm trying to remember who it was, but talking about how, like, you can't come up with a definition of table that will cover everything that, we would call a table and nothing that we would. But there's sort of a family relationship thing. And I think that's often true with a lot of ideologies, but it's often also hard to see the commonalities until you're stepping out way beyond. Because, so, like, for example, liberalism and conservatism, right? Like in US political context, or like left and right in general. Like, the things that get grouped onto those seem so, both the ideas and the subcategories seem so kind of random that you wonder, like, and often they seem to have more in common with opposing groups on the other side, which is one of the things about horseshoe theory. And I've been meaning for a while, I want to make a follow-up video, like asking about why midwits hate horseshoe theory, because on my video about how important is left and right, I had multiple people being like, I had horseshoe theory in the thumbnail to sort of criticize, and they were like, horseshoe theory argument is invalid. And it's like, it's a common, I actually, in middle school, I had, because I'm autistic, and so I had a paraprofessional assigned to me, and later, like, he was out and there's a substitute paraprofessional, and I was talking about, like, I sort of anticipated the idea of horseshoe theory, and I was describing, he's like, I was a political science major, and no political scientist, like, believes anything other than a linear left-right spectrum is credible, which, of course, was not true even then, but it's interesting. A lot of people have that reaction. At any rate, but the thing is, so I do think there is a general commonality in left and right, in that I've described this in various ways, but it is basically people on the left tend to deny that there is an underlying reality that constrains what they want to do. And they think that if you can imagine it, then it must be possible. Whereas people on the right have a tendency to, even if something worked 5 miles over there and 10 minutes ago, will say, well, it can't work here and now. And so Thomas Sowell talks about the constrained versus unconstrained vision. I think his critique of the unconstrained vision is pretty good as an analysis of the broad left. But then there's like a lot of people like me who believe in the unconstrained vision, or in the constrained vision, but don't believe in, we're not conservatives and couldn't really be on the right. And I've been, as I mentioned, I've been reading sort of two different political categories, because on one hand, I've been trying to read just anyone who is explicitly a critic of philosophical liberalism in general. But I've also been trying to read people who are associated with the political right more to understand them. And I'm realizing in a lot of ways, like, the ideological assumptions are more diverse, but they do one thing they tend to share is this, like, they're hyper constrained, like they're pessimistic about things that have been demonstrated to be plausible in very similar situations. And they're like, okay, but it couldn't work here. As well as there's a tendency, as I said on Twitter, that I think often the right tends to make a virtue of necessity and the left tends to make a necessity of virtue. So the right tends to be like, because I'm realizing, yeah, they're right. We need police, we need the military, we need immigration enforcement to some degree, but they sort of lionize these things and they like celebrate them and they excuse misbehavior because, oh, they're heroes, when they're people doing their jobs and they should be doing their jobs well. And then on the left, you have making necessity of virtue. It's, well, here's this ideological system that would work if everybody just, but of course, everyone will never just. And certainly not with ideas that go well against demonstrated human nature. And so that was me talking about prototype, like family resemblance theory, but also, like, there are often, you'll see things where you're like, what is the commonality? And then if you step out further, you're like, oh, I can actually kind of see it. And so I do think the kind of like with left right, for example, the commonality is, again, yeah, I agree with your critique of the left. I think the right is ineffective, like time and time again. Well, if you talk to people on the left, like they're frustrated with like both people on the left and right are convinced that, like, they'll talk about there's the stupid party and the evil party, and their party is always the stupid party, right? And then the other one is the evil party, and they feel like their people are ineffectual. And I think, like I've talked about, I think Samuel Francis sort of illustrated, like, the left and the right are ineffective in different ways and effective in different ways. And so the left has at least recently been sort of successful in winning the sort of the cultural like narrative, and sort of moving society to the point that goals often become inevitabilities. The right tends to be better at sort of capturing formal institutions and getting wins, like policy wins, whether it's from the courts or from the legislature, which is where it's supposed to come from. And that's, I mean, one of my critiques of originalism is they feel like the evolving standards judges or whatever it is, like legislated from the bench were judicial activists, so they invented their own kind of judicial activism. But I think both of them tend to be ineffective in serving the stated goals of what the base and like the rank and file say they want, but they tend to be effective in sort of serving the goals of keeping the people at the top, like, in power, in money, in influence, by always promising to solve these problems. And I think to some degree, like, that ineffectiveness is baked in because, like, the quip that I've often heard is that, what is it? Now I'm blanking on it. What I was going to reference, right? Like, if your job depends on like not solving a problem, right? I'm not quite getting it right, but if your job depends on not solving a problem, or your job depends on a problem, like, and you're addressing this problem, like treating the problem, you're going to put yourself out of business by solving it. Which I think the main reason that politicians fail to solve problems is because of, I think they want to. I think they're trying to solve problems that you can't solve by like political mandate. And then I think it ends up sort of working for them anyways, and so it sort of allows self-deception. But yeah, I want to kind of move off. And I was bringing up left and right as an example of two categories that seem so wide as to be, well, what do they have in common? And then it sort of becomes clearer if you can zoom out a bit. But let's see. Did I miss anything before I read another section? Nope, I don't. Let's see. So I don't think, so I did say in a video that I thought the most important political access is, to what degree do you think everything is fine or not? And so this person is asking, so what would the country look like if we function that way? And so that's an interesting question. I fundamentally don't think you could have like an electoral, like, party political system based on this in the way that we have now, because I think that if you had one party that basically thought everything was fine, I don't think there's enough people, like enough voters who think everything is fine to make that work, which is why, like, the elites of both parties tend to think everything is mostly fine, and then the rank and file think everything is not fine, but in different ways. So I think, but sort of my argument is that I think people who recognize everything is not fine should be trying to recognize the people who recognize everything is not fine. Like, that's the most important step. Most of our elites still don't recognize everything is not fine. And then if we want to actually solve the problems, it means working with the people who, like, recognize that stuff isn't fine, where we recognizing, what was I saying? Recognizing stuff that is not fine and recognizing this is what we can do, like, on a grassroots, like, institutional, organizational level. I've actually been thinking about, like, there is a meme about people with ADHD that we have a tendency to, like, buy supplies for, like, a hobby, learn the hobby, and then get bored and, like, never pick it up again. I'm like, yeah, I've done that. And I think, like, if I had like maker spaces, like with crafts and stuff that were convenient, there is one that's like 25 minutes from me, but it's the drive is not a pleasant one. And 25 minutes is just a little too far to just casually like go to a maker space anyways. And I'm like, but that's something where I think it's useful for people to know how to do things. And so having like a space where people can like learn how to do things and share materials is helpful. So recommend following Aaron Wren for unique, I'll look that up, Aaron Wren. Let's see. The Human, Cultural, and Institutional Foundations of American Flourishing in a Time to Transition. Okay, yeah, this looks interesting. I'll look at this more later. Thank you, Michael. That's it. Yeah, I didn't even know makerspaces like existed until I started reading Cory Doctorow's short fiction, because he has a number of short stories about that, which is, I think that is a function of fiction that we often overlook, is it, especially if it's set in the real world or the relatively like contemporary world, because even though Cory Doctorow is writing science fiction, like it's off generally near future, sort of tells us what is possible. So here's another section from a passage from Idries Shah that I wanted to make a video about for a while, sort of talking about self-help books in this case, but or at least that's how I perceive it. The Donkey and the Cactus. A donkey was chewing some cactus. A dog came along and said, "What are you eating?" "The most delicious of food," said the donkey. The dog took a bite at it. "You treacherous wretch," he cried. "You have deliberately misled me, and now my mouth is full of spines. The taste of this abominable vegetable is nothing like the juicy meat which I was thinking about." So commonplace books and personal libraries. So I've heard of commonplace books. What was that again? Is that's where you like write notes on your thoughts on books? Is that right? Let me check this. Yeah, okay, yep. So I think arguably I should consider trying to do a commonplace book. The problem is my writing, like just handwriting, is so bad that I can't read it if I'm actually doing handwriting. I can draw each letter, but that is excruciatingly slow. But I might still benefit from having a book where I copy things down, just write them, it's illegible, but note where I got it from and note that I thought this was worth writing down and possibly remember it. And then personal libraries. I mean, I have a personal library that is, given I want to move out of Texas, probably bigger than it needs to be, bigger than it should be, bigger than it's going to be convenient to move. But I would like to have like a bigger one if I have a forever home and I have the space and the money. Like I would like to have an Umberto level, like thousands, tens of thousands of books. And Paul or John, are you asking about the Beatles? I like George Harrison, is mostly because of his work with the Traveling Wilburys. I obviously strongly dislike John Lennon. Anyway, so personal libraries. Yeah, I mean, I made a video on it about buy books you don't need, which was sort of a follow-up. I made a couple of videos on Nassim Nicholas Taleb's idea of the anti-library and the Black Swan, which is based on the library of Umberto Eco. But at the same time, as I said, like most of my adulthood, I didn't buy books. I got them from the library because I didn't have money for them, like to buy books. And Massachusetts has a really good public library system, which, Michael, if you're in Massachusetts, you probably know this, right? Because you have not only do we have all the local like library networks, but then you can like do very easily interlibrary loan from pretty much anywhere in the state. And Massachusetts libraries keep old books, so it's easy to get. And so I think it is worth having personal. It's a very, like, depends on contingencies and like personal needs and preferences. But I definitely, my mother was always skeptical of the value of buying books, and I've realized buying books that I haven't read but that I might want to read, or even if I had the space and money that I might not want to read necessarily, is to remind myself these books exist, is a useful thing to do. I wonder if I've seen that one. Someone was talking about the video of Echo walking through his library. I think I might have. I think someone else talked about the anti-library. So before I launched this channel, I was watching a lot of BookTube to try to see what people are doing. I think someone else talked about the library and showed a clip from that video, but I don't think it was the whole video. So I'll look that up. Yeah, I want to do as a like subscriber special at some point. Well, if I could get my house clean, I'd do the whole, like, all my books. But I'm going to start with I'm thinking 25,000 subscribers. I will do just my sort of studio craft room, the books in there, and I'd estimate about a third of the books in my house are in the studio craft room area, and then about another third are in my bedroom, and then the remaining third are in my bedroom closet, or they're downstairs. And so thinking 25,000, I'll do the tour of the studio, like, which is easy to do. 50,000, I'll do the bedroom and the bedroom closet. And then if I like 75,000 or 100,000, I will, depending on how close I am to getting the place clean enough to film it. Yeah, I buy used books on AbeBooks. There are a number of sellers who sell there and not on Amazon. And typically, like, Abe will have the seller associations and stuff. But yeah, I bought books on AbeBooks. Unfortunately, Amazon owns it, and so it's gotten worse. But is BookTube good or bad? I think that depends. For what purpose? I think, because obviously, like, most of BookTube in terms of like views, like the people watch, is just, it's people sharing sort of trendy books and talking about them in a shallow manner, and I don't even engage with that at all. It's given me the opportunity to build an audience, to test ideas, and also when I start to sell things, to have the core niche of people who might be interested in buying them and sharing them, right? And that is helpful to me. It's also, if I were living in a pre-YouTube environment, I think I'd have an easier time like making a zine or a newsletter than I do the YouTube channel in some ways. But it's been helpful because it's gotten me better at like thinking how to talk to a camera. Like, I'm wanting to write a blog post about this, but I started out with these videos. I was writing scripts. So I used to I can type very fast, but I screwed up my hands to RSI, and they've never really gotten better. And I've seen a bunch of doctors who all missed. It was obviously seemed like tendonitis, but like one of them was like, it's carpal tunnel. I'm like, I don't think it's carpal tunnel. Like, it's not consistent at all. But I saw, yeah, it's not carpal tunnel. Anyways, hello, aloha. Anyways, right. And so I ended up starting to use speech to text, which I still have to do way more correcting stuff. And I couldn't get Dragon for Mac by the time that I screwed up my hands and was like looking into it, because it was Microsoft bought and discontinued it. But now there are newer things that I'm looking into. One of them is like free and you install it, and there's a couple that are subscription. I'm blanking on the names right now. Well, I'm not blanking. I don't really remember them to begin with because I looked them up once. But anyway, so I was using speech to text with manual corrections. And so when I was doing these videos initially, I was like writing scripts with that and then reading it and tripping over and editing it down. And it was like, YouTube recommended my video on The Alchemist to me recently, and I rewatched it. I'm like, oh man, I thought I did so well on this video when I did it, and it is painful to watch because I'm not really, and part of it is I probably had the camera up too high, but it looks like I'm not looking at the camera. I'm not at all expressive. I'm just reading off a script. And so then I was like, this is not working. Like, writing speech to text, like these scripts, and trying to read them and edit them, just not working for me. So I started speaking off the cuff, and I so speech to text, and then yeah, so I started speaking off the cuff, and I was initially like doing a lot of like ums and ahas. And so my early videos, like, I was just cutting those out, and then I started cutting out pauses, and I think I aggressively over edited early videos. And then people said I don't mind like the weird pauses, so I still cut some of them out if they like. I typically watch my videos twice when editing them, right? So I will edit them, go through once, like cut out where I'm I'll cut out things where I'm repeating myself or I redid a take because I screwed it up, where I go off on too much of a digression, I feel like, or where I start to articulate a thought and then don't finish it anywhere. And I'm like, I'll either finish it or I'll just cut that out. And I'll also cut out ums and ahs for the most part. And then I'll rewatch it and I'll cut out like a few of the pauses that sound really awkward, but I'm cutting that out less. And now I'm getting to the point, I think, like I'm fundamentally like, it is easier for me to like sort of work out my ideas in a normal conversation, right? But I've spent most of my life like writing and trying to work them out on paper. And so in a way, like I'm now finding it easier to like test thoughts on YouTube than on writing because I'm speaking to the camera more conversationally. Favorite movie director, Mel Brooks. Hello, Matthias Legends. And anyway, so this was me getting way off in the weeds about, do I think BookTube is good or bad thing on the net? And so I think, like, for me, as a creator, it is probably good that it exists in that it's helped me get better at public speaking, and in the environment that we have now, it's a useful tool. I do think if we were in an environment where it didn't exist and you only had like zines and stuff like that and newsletters, it's possible I might have had an easier time doing that, especially if I hadn't screwed up my hands, because I wouldn't have been like, if I was in like a zero gravity chair like this, right, and I wasn't quite as far back, but that is not a good posture. I think that's basically how I screwed up my hands. And so, but for like consumers, there are only, I'm thinking about, because there's like, let's see, I'm going to list off the YouTube booktubers that I know of that I like. And most of them, like, I don't watch that much, even if I like them, because it's YouTube in general. Like, I'm trying to watch less YouTube. And now that I'm making YouTube videos, I'm trying to prioritize stuff that I feel like is going to help me figure out how to do better myself, while also not getting way into like spending too much time watching YouTube. But so let's see. So of the creators that I found that I watch at least some of the time, so there's two big ones who are Daniel Green and Bookborn. And I guess Lady of the Library too, who I forget because she overlaps me frequently. And so think of her as more accessible or relatable. She's actually a big creator too. And then there's, so Allison Talks Books, or Randy Ray, the Literate Texan, and Book Chats with Shelley are probably the three booktube channels that I watch most frequently, but I watch most of Allison's stuff. I watch maybe a third of Shelley's stuff, and Randy just puts out so much and so long that I don't watch as much as I'd like to. And then I also like, then I also like Topher's Library, although I haven't watched a lot of his videos. And Rafe Blue Text is kind of interesting because and also Joseph Logstrom. They're both tiny. They both have like 2,000 subscribers, but they both, when I watch their videos, they're often thought-provoking. Well, with Rafe, it's typically like, he says the thought-provoking stuff in like the first third of the video, and then the rest of the video is sort of rambling. Any of Allison's videos that particularly impressed me? The one that she made about Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, You Might Be Exceptional, that came out around the time as a video by another non-booktuber creator that I've been thinking about, because I'm realizing like I am exceptional, and I don't, like, I've tried not to be, but it's also, English exceptional has sort of a strongly positive connotation, which with like American culture, you don't want to say, but like what I mean, so I had my Arabic teacher nicknamed me Al-Nader and then had me like look up what it meant, and it basically means like exceptional or eccentric. And I'm realizing like I am, like, in the much more pedantic term of like the original meaning, like I am, people are always trying to put me in boxes, and I'm always turning out to be the exception. Sometimes I know it and they're like, no, I've never seen an exception. It's like, yeah, I am. Sometimes I don't know it, and then I try to fit myself into the box and it doesn't work, which I don't know. Donkey and the Cactus story that I read is, anyway, but yeah, that one, I should rewatch it. But I remember, like, I mean, I love Ursula Le Guin. I'm thinking about actually making a video on, like, Ursula Le Guin's impact on my life. Novel to come back stronger after the divorce. I'm not sure what you mean by this. Do you know any novel to come back stronger after divorce? And then I got here late. Did autism get mentioned? I agree with what Magpie says about a subset of autistics. I'm in that set. There are other subsets that not share the same values. Is this about the... I think I was referencing, like, I'm not necessarily sure it's about ADHD people in general, but it's maybe triply exceptional, right? Because ADHD plus gifted. And Ortega y Gasset's idea of the natural aristocrat, which, of course, very, like, pretentious sounding to say it, but it's also memorable. TV series by Ingmar Bergman called Scenes of a Marriage. You'd be happy to be single. Congratulations on your diagnosis, assuming it wasn't from that Canadian diagnosis mill that all the TikTok, like, girlies are getting diagnosed at. But I assume it's, if you're watching my channel, you're not. I only know about this because I have a lot of friends who are autistic women, and it drives them crazy how these conventionally attractive, perfectly socially functional women are sort of adopting autism as an aesthetic and getting diagnosed. There's a particular Canadian diagnosis mill that all of them embrace autism as the name. But yeah, it's interesting because I really, as I've said a few times, I think I really would not have been, like, diagnosed. Normally most people like me would have either been diagnosed with ADHD or nothing as children. However, ADHD didn't cause problems in school. And then I had a 5th grade teacher who would give assignments that had a literal meaning and a common sense meaning. And she would then, like, say, don't be a smart aleck, like, use your common sense. And I'm like, what other possible interpretation of this is there? And so I ended up, even then, I only was able to get diagnosed. My speech therapist was like, yeah, your kid sounds like, I've worked with autistic kids. Your kid seems autistic. People had, like, suspected I was autistic before because of the spinning. But let's see. Anyways, yeah, I would not have been. But then there was, like, an autism specialist in central Massachusetts, actually. So I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to go set up upstairs. Stream might disconnect while I close my computer, and I'll be back in probably about 10 minutes. Yeah, I don't talk about AI a lot, and I'll answer that when I come back. But I'll be back in about 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to go set up again upstairs. So did I mute